listen to. Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Reena Bhatia. I'm the CEO of Proposal Helper and Bid Execs. We've been supporting companies for over 15 years in business. We supported almost 300 companies last year and with business development, capture, proposal support. And today's session is really focused on all the recent changes that we have been hearing about, to the FAR, to the SBA regulations. Our own clients ask us these questions, and I know a lot of you in the industry have the same. So we figured instead of us trying to answer each one individually, why not bring experts from PilieroMazza who specialize in all things government contracting? And Sai has been a dear friend of our organization and a partner, so we enjoy having and listening to him. I'm thrilled to invite Sai back to this webinar and have him tell you all about these changes that we have been seeing in the recent days. So with that, we'll keep this conversational. Please post your questions in the Q&A. We're not going to unmute anyone just to keep respectful of time and keep the conversation flowing. So please post your questions in the Q&A box. That's what I'll be monitoring. With that, let me hand it over, Sai, to you to introduce yourself and PilieroMazza and then the topic.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Reena. Good to be here with everybody. And I know this is sort of a hot topic, and it's ever evolving, and will probably continue to evolve over the next year at least. My name is Sai Alba. I'm a partner with PilieroMazza. I've been working in private practice with government contracting and sort of M&A issues for about almost a little over 20 years now, and I've been with PilieroMazza almost my entire career. So I've been here a long time, seen a lot of different administrations, a lot of different changes, a lot of different issues. So happy to be here with everyone, and we'll kind of talk through some of these sort of hot topics and some of the larger changes that have occurred, both as far as the SBA rules that changed and went into effect. They were initially proposed final at actually December of last year, but they didn't go into effect until January of this year, and January 16th to be exact. And so that January 16th, January 17th date is going to be important later when we talk about some of the recertification rules, which is the last thing up on here, which I know has been a very hot topic in and of itself for a lot of different companies, especially people that are looking to buy, looking to sell, looking to divest, things of that nature, take on even certain investment. So all of these things are kind of hot topics, and we'll walk through them individually. There are a lot of things in the rule change, though, so just be aware of that. It was a 200 plus page rule change. And then with some of the FAR rewrites that have occurred much more recently, they haven't gotten to FAR Part 19 yet, which is really with the small business issues. And I know there's been some discussion about some of the changes that just occurred, like FAR Part 6, for instance, and what that means, and people trying to read the tea leaves. So I would caution folks to not necessarily get out over their skis or listen to everything everyone's always people might be saying online about what the implications of some of the changes are, because I don't think it's very clear exactly what the changes will be to things like FAR Part 19 or some of the small business issues as of yet. You can kind of try to speculate, but that's all it would be, is speculation. So just be aware of that. Um, I wanted to kind of start here. It was really, I have in here the WSB program, but this change is a little broader than that, or more broader than that. It's a change where they tried to harmonize all the programs and have the same rules apply to each of them. So it used to be, and sort of still is, that every section has, or every program has their own section. So You've got 128, which is where they put some of the service-able vet stuff. You've got 126, you have 125. You've got the 124, which is for 8A. So for different programs, you're going to be looking at different parts of 13 CFR. And there were differences and nuances between all of them. And one of, I think, the best parts about the SBA rule changes is that they harmonized everything, or did the best they could to harmonize all the different programs so that the same rules applied to each of them. And this is also meant to assist SBA in their new certification process, because once all the kinks get worked out, which I know there's still a lot of issues, if anyone has tried to apply for programs or go through the certify process online, there's still issues with it. They're working through it. And obviously everyone knows there's been a lot of rifts or people leaving the agency, taking the early out or the resignation programs, all kinds of things. So just like everywhere else in the federal government, SBA is definitely short-staffed now in a lot of areas. And because of that, I think it's going to take even longer to iron some of these things out, but they're working on it. And the idea is that you go to apply for any of the programs, you submit all of your information, and at the end of that process, which they're hoping to expedite as well once it all gets fixed, at the end of that process, you'll be getting your certification for whatever programs you qualify for based on the information you provided to SBA. So it'll be more of a one-stop shop. And that's a major change. And to facilitate that, they wanted to have it so that all these different programs had similar requirements to them. So things like ownership or control, right? There were different rules about ownership or control and what it meant to control. For instance, what the biggest difference was for the service disabled vet program. It was very different from WOSB, very different from 8A. And some of that was because SDVOSB work had its own statute. The vets, I call it the vets first statute. That wasn't the actual name, but when the VA was given ownership over that program, which was subsequently removed and given back to SBA. But when the VA was given ownership over that entire program, there were different rules put in place. And then SBA adopted those rules for service-able vet, which made it very different from all the other programs, woman-owned, hubzone, 8A, etc. And that caused a lot of confusion. So when it comes to ownership or control, what actually happened was SBA adopted a lot of the changes from the SDVOSB side of things and brought them over to apply to all the other programs. But they loosened it a little bit. So when you're looking at ownership or control, there's certain things that the woman or the qualified 8A individual or the US citizen in the hub zone context or the service disabled vet has to have control over, right? So it's things like there are things that those individuals are allowed to not have control over is actually how it's structured. So things like um, changing the corporate documents, right? That used to be something that had to be in control of the woman or the 8A person or the serviceable vet or whatever it happens to be. Now they're allowing non-qualified owners to have veto rights over that, which makes perfect sense. Like it to say that an investor or a minority owner can't have a say in changing the operating agreement of the LLC they're a part of doesn't really make a lot of sense. So SBA understood that, and so they can now have veto rights over that. Things like if you are going to completely change the direction of the company, if you're going to add a member, if you're going to remove members, all of those things are on sort of the white list of items that the minority owner who might not be qualified can have a veto right over, or you can have unanimous consent in order to change the corporate documents, add a member. All of that is now okay across the board. However, SBA added as its last, like as of there's six things, as of the last one, which sort of envelops everything else. So that's really the one to talk about, is the minority owners or the non-qualified individuals are allowed to have veto rights over anything that is a just standard investor protection. What does that mean? It's not exactly clear from the regulations, and it doesn't specifically state in the regulations, like even examples of that. You could say the other items in there might be examples, but when it comes to the broad brush, you still need to look to case law. The good news is that there's a body of case law out there that exists for 8A and for woman owned and for other programs that have existed for many, many years. Now, whether or not every single case that exists that interprets what is an allowable item for a minority owner or non-qualified owner to have veto rights over, whether all of those cases are valid, will be valid, that different judges will view them the same way. We can't say for certain, but it's a very good guidepost. So, certain items like hiring and firing of officers, setting of salaries, spending money, spending corporate money or business funds, taking on debt. Those sorts of things are still items that the qualified individual has to have control over, and in some cases, sole control over. So, hiring and firing of officers, setting of salaries. The case law is pretty clear on that. That if the qualified owner doesn't have unanimous control over or complete control over it, then the minority owner, the non-qualified owner, will be deemed to control the entire company. It can cause affiliation, it can cause you to lose your status, all of those things. However, some of the other items I mentioned, like spending money or taking on debt, those are a little more nuanced. So if you have a situation where, let's say the company has a revolving line of credit and it needs $1 million every month to take on debt, to take on that revolving line of credit to make payroll. That's just the cycle. You take on debt of $1 million, you make your payroll, the government or whoever, your customers pay you, you pay down the debt, and it just every month, right? That's your cycle. If that's your cycle, then if you have a provision in your corporate documents that say you cannot spend more than $500,000 without the unanimous consent of the members, and some of the members are not qualified, let's say it's a woman-owned small business and some of the members are men, okay, that would be impermissible control because the company needs to spend $1 million or needs to take on $1 million in debt every single month. And so if you have unanimous consent for that, then that would allow the non-qualified owner to essentially block the business from performing any of its business. And so that's why those things would be deemed to be impermissible control. Now, there are many cases out there, as you could imagine, decades worth of case law that say certain things are okay, certain things are not okay. And so you still need to go look or understand what the case law says. And some of them are not exactly very clear. Like there could be instances where the language in your agreement is kind of on the line on certain issues, and that's a business question: is whether or not you're willing to take on certain risks. However, it's a lot better than what could have occurred, which is under the SDVOSB program, which they thought about bringing over into all the programs, would list like a hard line of these 5 things are the only things that a minority owner can ever have veto rights over, or you can ever have unanimous consent provisions relating to. And in that context, it was clearly problematic because there were a number of things on there, or not listed, I should say, where a minority owner would want some input in the company that they're investing in. So SBA understood that, and they're attempting to loosen up the ownership and control rules a little bit. Ownership still has to be direct, though, which I know is a frustration of a lot of people. So, with all the programs, the human being individual needs to own the company. It can be owned through certain things like living trusts, but you can't have like a blocker or a holdco company in between. And a lot of people would like to do that. A lot of people would like to have a holdco and then have a company under the holdco that is a WSB and another one that does certain other types of work that maybe is just a small business, and just have different subsidiaries under a holding company. Or for whatever reason, people want a holding company because they think it gives them more protection, which isn't exactly true. But there's various reasons why people would want to do that. However, for WSB, for 8A, for service-able vet, you cannot have holdcos in between. That rule still applies. That's still important to have. The profit distribution now across all of these programs, they have to be commensurate with ownership. Now, there are certain things people do, like synthetic equity or phantom equity, where you could structure things so that other people are getting certain percentages based on some of these synthetic equity plans. And just to be clear, synthetic equity is not actual equity, and it's technically not a profits interest. It's more like debt. You could almost think of it as the company owes money based on certain terms and conditions to certain employees or owners. And because of the way it's structured, it sort of hasn't been scrutinized by SBA as much. And there's nothing in the regulations that speaks to synthetic equity or to phantom equity. And so because of that, you could have synthetic or phantom equity plans structured so that certain individuals get amounts of money, and that comes out above the line. Like I said, it can be looked at as debt almost. So the company can pay it out, and then it doesn't interfere with the distribution of profits, because the profits are what falls below the line. So that's something that can still be done. The highest compensation requirement is something that was added to WOSB. So the woman or the veteran or the qualified 8A individual has to be the highest compensated in the company. And that applies across the board when you're looking at total compensation. So if you're a W-2, let's say you're an S Corp or something, and you're a W-2 or your standard Corp, C Corp, and you can be a W-2 employee, you look at not just your W-2 earnings, but you also look at all the other earnings you had through distributions. Or if you're an S Corp or you're an LLC, all the money that you made that you might have just kept in the company as retained earnings, but it's still, you are taxed on it. That's all considered to be part of the owner's income and is taken into account to make sure that they're the highest compensated. So that gives you some sort of flexibility. They also allowed for the possibility of giving a basis to SBA as to why someone who is not the qualified individual might be getting paid more. And that's something that was also brought over from the SDVOSB rules. So you do have to give notice to SBA within 30 days of any sort of change, but you could tell them, hey, Sue is getting paid $50,000 more than me, even though I'm the woman or I'm the veteran, because she did a great job. She brought in like this major contract, and in order to keep her here, the market value is $200,000, even though I'm only making 150. That kind of thing, SBA should be okay with it. If it is ongoing repeatedly year after year after year, they might start to scrutinize it more. And if the gap becomes larger, so if I'm making 50,000 and I'm paying someone else 300,000 and I'm the qualified individual, SBA may take issue with that, probably will take issue with that, because it's so far away from you being the highest compensated, as opposed to smaller deltas between you and the employee that you've deemed that you need to pay more. Also, you can look at the company. How new is it? Is the owner putting in money? Are you even like losing money? Those sorts of things SBA now does take into account, and they will listen. You just need to make sure that you've provided them with notice and given the explanation. Um, They've changed it so now you can also have rights of first refusal. Why that was ever impermissible, I don't know, but there used to be rules against that so that if a non-qualified individual had a right of first refusal to match an offer to buy the majority of the company, that was deemed to be impermissible control by a non-qualified individual. That's no longer the case. So those sorts of rights are allowed and they can be in your corporate documents. Um, and this idea of restrictions on fees for people to be helped through either the application process for certain socioeconomic programs like WSB 8A, Serviceable Vet, or things of that nature. Those are now something that are restricted, and that rule was carried over from the 8A program. So as you can see, SBA sort of is pulling from different ideas and different programs to consolidate them to really push to make sure everything is the same. Congress is also getting into this game. So Congress has some fears that, and now I think there's a whole nother one, like after I put this together, where Loeffler has now announced that they're looking and auditing all 8A companies, or the 8A program, I should say. She didn't say all 8A companies. They're auditing the 8A program because she thinks there's a lot of waste or fraud in the program. So that's another item to kind of list here. But Congress is trying to put together things like the WSB Accountability Act to make sure that only women are getting awards through the program, and that things like it's fairly common, I'm sure everyone knows, where it might be a husband-wife team, maybe the husband transferred 51% ownership to the wife. And in many cases, it's completely above board, right? There's the woman is there, she's controlling the company, everything's up and up, but not in all cases. So they're pushing for more accountability there, trying to make it so the rules and regulations are easier to understand and contracts are easier to understand. And that's what the Plain Language and Contracting Act is about. Some of that, I'm not sure how far that's really going to get, just because even when you're trying to be as simple as possible, and we see it all the time in some of these procurements, especially the big IDIQs, the language is always very confusing because they're trying to be clear, but in being clear, they might not understand the government officials that are writing things might not understand the entire web of laws and regulations. So oftentimes, instead of just saying you have to comply with 13 CFR, they'll try to paraphrase what is in the law. And that's always dangerous because the law isn't just what's written, it's a whole body of case law supporting the interpretations behind those words, that exact language in the statute, in the regulation. Everything, even commas, right? Literally, have been scrutinized by courts in many cases to clarify what they mean. And when you try to paraphrase it, it creates all kinds of problems. So I'm a little skeptical about this, but it's something that I think ideally they want to make it simpler. But in my mind, by trying to make it simpler, you're actually going to just create more problems and more litigation because there's a way that the British common law, frankly, was structured hundreds and hundreds of years ago as to how you interpret statutes and regulations that the United States adopted also hundreds of years ago. And those are like the underpinnings of the entire legal system, and those will still exist. So if you try to again paraphrase or try to be too clear, but it conflicts with other laws or regulation or arguably conflicts with law or regulation, it's just going to lead to further issues. That's also part of my questions about some of the FAR rewrites, because when you're rewriting the FAR and you're saying things, you're putting things in there that are only statutory or things of that nature, or even some of the FAR rewrites that we've already seen that say things like, to the maximum extent practicable, the contracting officer shall do X. Well, I think the people that are rewriting this think that that's clear, that it's like, oh yeah, well, they have a lot of discretion. The contracting officer should be able to look at a specific situation and decide how best to proceed. Yeah, but what does the maximum practical extent mean? Who's going to figure that out? It's going to be a court. So when you try to make language so broad, you're inviting litigation. You're inviting courts to come in to interpret what new words mean. So any change that they make is just going to invite that, as opposed to leaving the language that's there that has already been litigated over and there's already case law. So that's just something I'm not sure they're clearly thinking through, but it's all part of this entire thing. Also, this transparency and predictability and opportunities. I'm not sure this is really going to go anywhere either, because there seems to be some pushback on even supporting small businesses as much. Now, some of that tide is changing. We've been meeting with people on the Hill. I talked to some folks last week, in fact, about supporting small businesses and continuing these small business programs, how they help the U.S. economy more than anything else, certainly more than going with publicly traded companies that might have many foreign owners. So it's something where some folks in Congress would like to make it so that small businesses have a better opportunity if things are canceled to to get help to find another contract. But with the ways current things are going, and I think DOGE sort of ramping up, ramping down. I know they're in some agencies now, taking a look at things. I'm not sure this is really going to go anywhere either, at least with the current makeup of the House and the Senate. Similarly, with the rule of two is something that is not statutory. It's only regulatory. It's only ever been regulatory. And it says that if two or more small businesses can perform work at a reasonable price, the entire procurement is supposed to be set aside for small businesses of some type. The current regulations in the FAR and in 13 CFR both say that, right? That's part of the regulation. And it says that you should look towards some of the specific programs first and then go to small business programs, just the vanilla small business program, to try to find someone or two or more companies that can do that work. The law allows for different sole source opportunities. So if you decide the contracting officer decides they're going to set it aside for WSB participation, then they only get a response from one. That can be a basis for sole sourcing to WSB. With 8A, you can sole source without any justification at all. That's a special piece of that program. But it's one of those issues that's become a hot topic. This HR 2804 has been pushed forward, although I think it was done on the Democratic side. And former Chairman Guzman she put forward another bill as well to try to codify the rule of two. And I think they're trying to see if they can get it in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the main acts that ever gets passed through Congress on an annual basis, usually at the end of the calendar year. So if that goes forward, then we could see some more protection for small businesses. But I know there's been pushback. However, that pushback has had pushback. And so I've talked to some of the folks in the majority in the House and the Senate, and there is some willingness to think about codifying that. And it might be something that turns up in negotiations between the Democrats and the Republicans as to how best to implement that. So we're keeping our eye on that, because if they codify the rule of two, then it would be impossible to remove it from any of the regulations in 13 CFR or in FAR Part 19 if that rewrite occurs. And for small businesses, the rewrite of FAR Part 19, the proposed rewrite, is probably going to be the hottest topic because that's the most important one. And we're keeping a close eye on that. Another big deal when it comes to calculation of receipts for small businesses and for any size standard that deals with your size based on revenues as opposed to employees, there were some cases that came out last year that said SBA should be looking purely at tax returns. So if you have something that's not in your tax return, specifically, this was huge for IT value-added resellers because there was something called ASC 606 that was an accounting, a GAAP method of accounting that allowed these sorts of companies to only put through things on the key lines of their tax returns, the total income and cost of goods sold lines specifically, that only counted the amounts that they kept, as opposed to all of the amounts that got passed through to, let's say, the software company, if you were an IT value-added reseller. You're buying from, Carasoft or somebody. All those amounts that you took on that you passed through weren't on your tax return. And so people were claiming they were still small businesses for service codes because maybe they only made 2%. And so they were only calculating their receipts based on the 2% that they kept, not the full amount of the contract. There were some questions about whether that was allowable. There was, in fact, a district court case that ruled that doing that and claiming small business status by excluding all those pass-through revenues was fraud and was a violation of the False Claims Act. However, after that district court case, which is technically still good law, but after that district court case, the Office of Hearings and Appeals at SBA said, no, you should be looking at tax returns in a very similar case, in a very similar fact pattern case. So now we have the OHA ruling that said only tax returns, the district court case that says if you only use tax returns, you're committing fraud. And now SBA has said, okay, we have to clarify this. So they clarified that you should be looking primarily at the tax returns. However, in some of the language that was adopted in the final rule, it does allow SBA some flexibility to look beyond that and to try to use an analysis similar to all the other analyses they use under a totality of the circumstances test to take a closer look at all of the revenues a company has. However, our experience has been that they truly are looking at the tax returns and that things like ASC 606 and legitimate accounting methods that are allowed by the IRS and do not violate IRS rules are things that SBA is going to accept. So if there are accounting methods and mechanisms to be used to remove certain revenue from the cost of goods sold or the total receipts line items of your tax return, those are likely legitimate methods to reduce your size or to stay small longer. So that is a massive change, potentially, especially like I said, for resellers. But I don't know all the different accounting methods or tricks or things that could be used. So just keep an eye on that. And you might want to talk to your CPA or your accountants, or whoever's doing your taxes, about potential options, or just inquire and see what might be out there as to ways to run these calculations. A different issue here with ostensible subcontractor, the rule generally is that if you're unduly reliant on a subcontractor to perform primary and vital functions, you can be deemed affiliated with them, and therefore you have to aggregate your size and theirs. If your subcontractor is a large business, obviously that's bad because it makes you a large business and ineligible for whatever procurement you're going after. SBA took this concept and they're now applying it to joint ventures. So if you are within a joint venture and the managing venture is not going to perform at least 40% of the work inside of that joint venture, then they're going to apply the ostensible subcontractor rule to that scenario and find the one joint venture member affiliated with the other, unless the joint venture member that you're deemed affiliated with is similarly situated. So, for instance, let's say we have an 8A joint venture and only one member is 8A and the other member of the joint venture, even though they're a small business, is not 8A. In that scenario, the two members of the joint venture are supposed to be doing, in let's say a services context, the two members of the joint venture are supposed to be doing 51% of the total dollars under the contract. The other 49% can be subcontracted to Lockheed or whoever else. Um, as and out of the 51%, let's say that the members are doing together, the 8A company should be doing 40% of that. So roughly 20% of the total contract. If you're not doing that, if you're only doing 10% of the total contract, and the other member of the joint venture is doing the rest, and so you're outside of this 40-60 split. SBA, if someone challenges you, will find that you're affiliated with the other JV member, even if they're a small business, because they're not 8A. So they can't be similarly situated to you in this example. That would mean then that you need to aggregate the two companies. Now, you might be okay from a size perspective if they're really small and you're really small. But if let's say it's a $20 million size standard and you're both $15 million in your 5-year average, if you're affiliated, you're now a $30 million company. You're no longer eligible. Your JV is a large business. So if you're deemed to be violating this and someone protests you or challenges you, and this challenge can come from a competitor, it can come from SBA itself, it can come from a contracting officer, in any of those circumstances, if you're challenged and you're deemed to have been violating the rule or proposed to violate the rule, let's say your teaming agreement isn't clear or your proposal that you submitted states it doesn't really clarify who's doing what amount of work or how the work is going to be split. All of those things create risk factors that then the joint venture might be deemed to be violating this ostensible subcontractor rule. And so you need to be very careful that in your proposal, in any sort of teaming agreements, in any addendum to a joint venture agreement, whatever you have in place that is created prior to the submission of the proposal or with the proposal itself, that those documents make it clear that even in the context of a joint venture, you're going to meet the 40-60 split at a minimum, meaning the qualified members of the joint venture are going to hit the 40%. That 40% can be met by any qualified members. So let's say it's, again, an 8A JV. You've got 3 members, 2 are 8A. You could split that 40% between the two 8A companies, assuming they're all small, right? And these two are qualified 8A. You could split that. So it could be 20, 20, 60 out of whatever the JV is doing. So again, the JV itself, the aggregate of all members, has to be doing at least 50%, usually 51. And out of that amount, whatever that percentage is that the JV is doing, the qualified members have to be doing 40% of that percentage. So if you have no subcontractors, the JV is doing 100% of the work. That means the qualified members of the JV have to be doing 40% of the full contract. If you're only doing 50% of the contract in the JV, all the members together, and the other 50% is being subcontracted to Lockheed, then the qualified members of the JV have to do 40% of the 50%. And that all of that is calculated on a period by period basis over the course of the contract. So if the contract is a 6-month base period and then 4 1-year options, you have to meet those requirements during the first 6 months and then every year thereafter, resetting every period. And a new calculation has to be done. If it's a 1 + 4, it's the first year and then every year after that. If it's a 3-year base period and two 1-year options, then you can meet the first piece of it over a 3-year period and then every year thereafter. So you really have to look at what the contract says, what the requirements are, what's your base period, and think about how you're going to distribute work, because it used to be that no one could really challenge what's going on, and that's why there's not a lot of case law specifically on performance of work issues. It was only a false claim question, which is really more of a DOJ investigation issue. But now I think we're going to see an uptick in protests of joint ventures specifically because of the application of this rule. And if you have things in your proposal that make it seem like you could be violating this, you're going to put yourself at risk. So be aware of that. When it comes to mentor-protégé and joint venture changes, the main takeaway here is that this was sort of scrapped. There was a big fight in Congress. A number of lobbyists challenged SBA on some of these things, and they decided to kind of hold off on making any final rule changes, but they're still supposedly coming because of the moratorium on new regulations now under the new administration. That might not happen until 2026, but keep your eye out there on things that are occurring. They plan to clarify that only for-profit companies can be mentors. Now, this has occurred. Frankly, this was already a rule, but they clarified it. So nonprofits cannot be mentor companies. They also clarified that if a company, let's say a large business, buys another company and merges them together, the acquiring company already has 3 protégés, but they buy a company that has another 2. SBA can allow, in that specific instance, for the mentor to have more than 3 protégés, which is usually the max, because of the acquisition. So that's, I think, a good rule. We've seen SBA be fairly generous in that regard. So it allows the protégés that are part of the acquired companies, teams, to not lose out, right? Because otherwise, the mentor-protégé would be terminated, and future procurements might be put at risk. So SBA understood that. So I think that's a good rule change. And it allows this sort of continuity of work to happen. And also, if you have a situation where you've got a mentor-protégé arrangement where some of the key managers of personnel become employees of both the mentor and the protégé firms at the same time, that SBA could then say, well, we're terminating the mentor-protégé relationship because the companies are now too interconnected. So it's just something to think about if there is any sort of sharing there, or because of an acquisition or transferring of personnel, which is really what SBA was worried about, where a mentor would transfer some of its people on a part-time basis to the protégé. SBA doesn't like that. And so you shouldn't be sharing employees between the companies, or SBA can now terminate. It's more clear that they could terminate the mentor protégé. So those are some of the main issues that have already occurred, and there are definitely going to be more changes coming because they would like to revamp, I think, the mentor-protégé program. Hopefully make some things more streamlined, but it's something that's been put on hold a little bit. There was also some confusion about past performance activity. The takeaway here is that they clarified, especially as part of this AOSP4 procurement, which I know has been like pox ridden, but with that procurement, there were questions about whether or not the agency could force the protégé to have any experience, or could they rely entirely on the mentor. That's now been clarified that agencies are allowed to require a company to a protégé to have some experience. They can't make them have too much, which is a question of fact that could be litigated. But if they say, okay, you need 3 past performance reference, at least 1 needs to come from the protégé, that's been deemed to be completely permissible, and now the regulations allow for that to occur. So that's something that's been updated and changed in the final rule. Um, Now, you don't have to do that, right? That's also part of the rule that in theory they could rely on the mentor having just the mentor's experience as part of a mentor-protégé joint venture or even a prime sub relationship. But I personally have seen more agencies err on the side of caution on that and actually wanting the protege to have some experience, because I heard that part of the reason for that was during performance, proteges were failing to do the requisite percentage of work, either in a joint venture or even outside of a joint venture, and the mentor was taking over. And in order to stop that from happening, they want the protege to give some proof that they can perform the work. So that's now clearly allowed, and you're probably going to see that in more procurements going forward. Uh, a big issue, and this is kind of the last kind of main piece of this, is recertification of size. I don't, given timing, I don't want to go through every slide like line by line. You guys can read them, but the big, huge thing here is that now because of the recertification rule, there is a major change that's occurred. As of January 17th at midnight, so at 11:59 p.m. on January 16th, 2026 is the last time you can recertify under the old rule. If there's any sort of merger or acquisition or a recertification of any kind that occurs prior to midnight, January 17th, if you recertify as ineligible for any reason, the current rule or old rule applies. That means that you can still bid task orders under IDIQ contracts, and you can still get option years on IDIQ contracts unless there is a later recertification event after January 17th, 2026. That is the way that the current rule works, and that is the way it will continue to work until that time. However, if there's any recertification event after midnight, January 17th, 2026, if you have IDIQ contracts where you're no longer eligible, the company that recertifies will have a quote unquote disqualifying recertification. And that will mean that the company can no longer bid new task orders and they can no longer get option years under that IDIQ contract any longer. So that is a major change, especially for M&A activity for small businesses in particular that might have gotten on IDIQ contracts thinking there was a lot of value there. Now, if there is any sort of M&A activity or recertification after January 17th of next year, the value of those IDIQs will be greatly diminished. And remember, that's not just the recertification because of the acquisition, that's any recertification. So if you're a company that's looking to be acquired or looking to buy, frankly, because you have to recertify on contracts then as well, if you are buying or selling or going through M&A activity, let's say this year, and let's say you get it all done and you recertify on January 10th of 2026, and you're like, okay, we got under the gun, we did our recertification, we're still eligible. However, let's say the contract was originally awarded in June of what would it be? June of 2021, right? Well, June of 2026 is 5 years. And if it's a long-term contract longer than 5 years, there's a different rule that requires you to recertify within 120 days of the end of the fifth year. So you take 120 days, right, and you back it up from June. Now you're sitting there, and instead of June, you're looking at February. February is after January 17th. So when you're looking at January 17th as the cutoff date, even though you recertified on January 10th, you're going to have, because of the M&A, you're going to have to recertify again in February because of the 5-year rule. And if because of the M&A activity, you're no longer a small business, you're going to recertify a second time within 2 months. And that second recertification is going to be after January 17th, and therefore you will have a disqualifying event and no longer be eligible for bidding new task orders and no longer eligible for option years under the IDIQ contract. You're still eligible to get task orders on single award contracts, single award BPAs. You're able to get option years on single award contracts. None of that is going to change. It's only multiple award IDIQ contracts where you're going to be ineligible for option years on the actual contract. So any task orders you were awarded, even if they're multi-year task orders, you can still get all those. And you're not eligible to bid new task orders. The other piece to remember here is the 180-day rule. So if you go through M&A activity within 180 days of when you submitted a bid, you need to tell the agency and recertify. And if you recertify as other than small or for another reason ineligible, you're not eligible then to get that award anymore. If you go through some M&A activity and you close outside of that 180-day window, so let's say you bid something in February of 2025 and then you close on an M&A deal in December of 2025, that is outside of the 6 months from when you submitted that proposal. In that context, you're still eligible to win the award. The agency just can't take credit for the dollars they spend on you anymore. So there's a lot of nuances here, and this new rule sort of ups the ante and ups the risk when it comes to recertification and the impacts of the recertification. And you can see all this if you go to 13 CFR 125.12. That is a new regulation, and this is what I just said. If you go to that regulation, you can look up and you can actually see the text of the new rule, and it's right there. Now, some of it's written in a confusing manner. I'm obviously happy to kind of talk it through with anyone who might have questions about all of this, but uh, people are definitely taking strategies to do M&A this year to try to get around the rule or avoid the draconian impacts of this rule. And in addition, there are certainly groups that I know a lot of folks are working with right now that are lobbying, and there's some word on the street that Congress might use the Congressional Review Act to actually wipe out the rule change. Um, Unclear exactly when that's going to happen, but I do know that it's caught the attention of SBA. And the latest I've heard from SBA is they're actually rethinking this rule and they might be changing it to make it less draconian because of the impact that it has on the value of small businesses and the exit potential of folks that might have poured their blood, sweat, tears, and retirement funds into their company that might be looking at the fact that their value of that has just been eviscerated because of rule changes. So SBA is paying attention to that, and I think there could be likely changes. So again, this slide in particular goes over what I just stated, which is the main pieces of the rule, but keep an eye on it because they might be changing in the near future. And those are some of the big changes here. And I want to leave some time. I don't know if there's been some questions, but given we got a few minutes left. I don't know, Reena, if there's some questions or
Yeah.
something we can go over.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is a lot of great information, lot to digest. I just want to let all the participants or attendees know we have recorded this and we'll make the recording available because listening to it one time, you live and breathe this every day, but you need to listen to this multiple times to really capture. And so thank you for sharing. But I'm going to go over some questions in the Q&A. Again, folks, the Q&A channel is open if you want to submit questions. And then we had some early questions that had come in to us, so I'll try to get to those. But real quick here, Ken is asking if anyone is looking at re-examining the current size standards of the NAICS codes that would then help small businesses remain small businesses for a longer. Do you know anything about changing size standards of NAICS codes?
Yeah, the SBA is supposed to be doing that on a semi-annual basis. they've been doing it on a rolling basis, so certain codes come up every year, and they would like that to be on a cadence of like a 5-year cadence, so that every NAICS code gets refreshed at least every 5 years, if not more. The latest I've heard is that because of the, again, just staffing, like the rifts and the retirements and all of that, that they're really behind, and it's going to take some time for them to figure out how to meet the cadence or what they can do. But they should be announcing some changes to certain codes this year. I just don't know which ones those are going to be yet, because they're trying to run that analysis still and figure out which ones they can triage.
Right. And I guess RIF is the answer to everything not getting done, unfortunately. Another question that came in, and I think you answered this, but I'm going to repeat it. On the JV ostensible subcontractor rule consideration, would that apply to approved mentor-protégé relationships?
Yes, yeah. So just because you're in a mentor-protégé doesn't make you immune from affiliation, like ever. It only makes you immune from certain things that are listed explicitly in your mentor-protégé agreement. And then on top of that, this new rule, even if you say things like, "Yeah, we're gonna, work together in a joint venture," or whatever, something like that, you still have to make sure you're in compliance. And if someone challenges you, even if you're in a mentor-protégé, you're still susceptible.
Okay. Another question, is the current administration actively reducing the women-owned small business set-asides to ensure they do not exceed the 5% statutory set-aside? Are they actively reducing set-asides?
I have not, certainly nothing explicit about actively reducing it or trying to just barely hit the goal on any of the programs, whether it be woman-owned, 8A, serviceable vet, etc. I haven't heard of them being direct in that. There's speculation that maybe they're trying to reduce things, or there's even been speculation that by the end of the summer, the only programs that'll exist will be serviceable vet and small business. Now, that can't literally be true because they're statutory, right? Congress has mandated that these programs exist and that they're supposed to the maximum practical extent, meet the goals. And if they're purposefully failing to meet the goals, they'd certainly be subject to litigation and injunctions. But we've seen a lot of injunctions, so maybe that's not as scary as it used to be. Um, but I haven't heard anything that's that explicit. And I also know there's a number of groups that are even Republican organizations that are pressuring Congress and pressuring the administration to fully support the 8A program and fully support small business programs. And I know I've been working with some of these organizations as well to kind of get behind the scenes and kind of push for all of that too. So folks have been saying the right things, but I think we'll just have to kind of see how things work out and whether or not the more forceful methods will be necessary. And there are also efforts in Congress to try to codify more specificity. But from what I've heard, most of those things are coming from the minority side right now, the Democratic side of things. And so who knows if they can get through the NDAA or if they'll have to wait until some later date.
Yeah, and speaking of, the 8A program, the question that we often get asked is, well, is the 8A program going to go away, but the super 8As, the ANCs, the tribals, those are actually going to be strengthened, correct? Any thoughts on that?
So there's really only one program. The thought that there's multiple programs is a misnomer. There are different rules, but it's one program. So if the program went away, it would go away for everybody. And they would also take a statute to do that, literal act of Congress. So however, if they were to sort of shift things around and the administration or different agencies would decide, well, we're just going to do a bunch of sole source awards to tribes and ANCs. I mean, in theory, I guess you could do that, and you could meet your 8A goals doing that. That though has been true forever. any administration or any agency could have done that and technically met the rule. I think you'd get a lot of pushback because there's folks. I've even talked to senators in places like Iowa, right, where there's a lot of standard 8A companies that are their constituents that they're interested in in supporting still. So I'm not sure that that would go through without a lot of pushback and things of that nature.
Okay. And I know we're coming up on time here, but I have a couple sort of summarizing questions. So of all the changes that you've covered today and those lots of good detail, which one do you think will catch most of the small businesses off guard in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think it's the recertification rule. Because people they're gonna like think about buying a contract, or they're gonna end up on a 5-year recertification early next year, like the example I used in February, not realizing the implications of the recertification, which would make them ineligible to bid new task orders. And so things in your pipeline, and so even if you don't go through an M&A activity, right? If there are things in your pipeline that are important in 2026, and the 5-year recertification is coming up before that, you might probably, well, if you're not going to be eligible, you're not eligible to bid that work anymore because of the disqualification rules for multiple award IDIQs. So thinking about what to do, moving that contract into a joint venture with where you become the mentor and you find a protege. There are things you can do now to think about how to act depending on your fact pattern and the implications. But I think that a lot of people are not going to do that and then only realize after the fact that they've been harmed by this rule if it stays in place. Because, like I said, there's pushes to overturn it.
And Sai, do you have a couple more minutes here? Because we got some additional questions, or do you have to drop?
Sure. Yeah,
Can I go?
I can
Okay.
stay.
We'll do two more and then I promise you we'll stop. So the M&A recertification requirements, do they apply to GSA IDIQ mass contracts as well? And are the timings any different?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because the draconian impacts here, meaning the inability to bid task orders and the inability to get option years, that applies immediately. So there, for GSA schedules, there is no sort of moratorium or delayed impact. I should have noted that. So if you go through an M&A transaction today, right now, right, and you recertify within 30 days, if the buyer or the seller has a GSA schedule, the impact of that recertification is going to mean you can't bid small business if assuming you have a disqualifying recertification where you say you're large or ineligible, then you're not going to be able to bid new task orders under the GSA schedule right out of the gate. However, that's not that different than the way it already is, because GSA has frankly just not been following the rules. And the way they've been operating for years is that they immediately change your status on your schedule. And so the practical effect of that is that even 2 years ago, they would change your status and you'd stop seeing stuff through eBuy or through the various mechanisms that the agencies use to find people. And so the practical reality is it's not that different, but the legal reality is different. And so because of the way they drafted the rule, our interpretation of looking at the text is that it applies to GSA schedules right now. So any sort of transaction with a schedule would mean you're not eligible to bid task orders. But because it's a full and open contract, your options won't be impacted. It just any set aside orders you wouldn't be eligible for.
Gotcha. And I am looking at some of the other early questions. I think you've answered almost all of them throughout your discussions. I'm not going to repeat those. Any closing remarks, anything that a small business should rush to their desk right now and be ready so they're not scrambling? What would you advise small businesses to do?
I think the number one thing is to right now, I think there's a blog on our website about it. I'm sure people can find it on, LinkedIn or wherever. But Congress is looking for input on the rule of two issue and codification of the rule of two. So to the extent that you could write your congressmen, your senators to express support for codification of the rule of two if you're a small business, that's probably the number one thing you can do to help yourself. Because if that gets codified, then it can't change. And it will also give even strength in a bid protest context or in other challenges. So it gives way more legal rights as well to sort of force the administration or any administration to solicit work from small businesses, because they would have to go through that process of evaluating whether two or more small businesses can perform the work at a reasonable price. And if they don't do it, they're in violation of a law, not just the regulation. And that is something they're seeking today, like right now. They're looking for input on that. It was supposed to be through the middle of July, I think, so next like week or two, but it's probably going to be extended to where they're going to ask for input potentially even through September. I'm looking into that right now because I got a question earlier today on that, and we'll probably do an update to the blog. But that would, I think, be the number one thing to support yourself and to support the small business community.
Yeah, and one thing I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of small businesses feel writing to their Congress members really doesn't do anything. It does. So you should stand up and participate in that. If you're not doing it, the large businesses are doing it. So protect the small business, but you protect yourselves. Please go to PilieroMazza's website, find that blog, or uh, Sai, if you want to share that link with us, we'll distribute it to everybody with the recording of this webinar. So appreciate you joining today. I'm sure we'll follow up again as more changes come. Look forward to having more of these discussions with you in the future. Really appreciate your time. Again, if anyone has any requirements or questions about government contracting from a legal standpoint, please reach out to Sai and PilieroMazza for any support that you might need. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to having you again on our future discussions. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.